one of the interesting things about running in the woods is that you're looking around. You stay lively. Your feet are feeling the ground. Your eyes are seeing. You're balancing. Everything is mobile. When you're in the city and everything looks like shit and you don't want to look at it and you put on headphones, you can kind of disrupt a lot of little lively mobility. All the sensors are comparators. So in order to sense you're moving, muscles are changing length. This is what good posture is. You
Yeah.
know, when posture is good, opposing muscles are changing length. It's called myotatic reflex, right? That one is lengthening and the other is shortening, and they alternate. And having opposing muscles set against each other, not a good thing. So there's something about out in the woods, it looks good. You're looking around, your feet are responding to the ground.
FC2O. From chaos to order. From chaos to order. Here we go. From chaos to order. From chaos to order. FC2O.
Hello and welcome to another edition of FC2O. Today we have Alexander teacher and runner Lawrence Smith joining us all the way from Montreal. Lawrence has worked using the Alexander technique as an actor and dancer since the 1970s, eventually training and qualifying as an Alexander teacher in the late 80s. He directed the Manhattan Center for the Alexander Technique in New York City for over 10 years before moving to Montreal in 1998 and has taught world-renowned dancers, actors, athletes and musicians, including the Montreal Symphony Orchestra. Along with his private practice, Lawrence teaches dancers and musicians at the University of Quebec at Montreal and gives private lessons at the Schulich School of Music at McGill University. But Lawrence isn't just a theory guy. He's been out in the trenches as a cross-country skier, swimmer and runner for more than 40 years, applying everything that he knows and has learned from Alexander, winning numerous competitions. And as you may pick up from his very calming manner, he is also a practitioner of Tai Chi Chuan. So I hope you enjoy Lawrence's take on posture, function and everything Alexander. Enjoy the show. Here we go. Welcome to another edition of FC2O. Today I have Lawrence Smith with me, who is an Alexander technique practitioner. And Lawrence, I've known of you, and we've kind of exchanged messages over an online forum for barefoot runners for, I was just looking back, and I think it's not far off 10 years now. So I've had that awareness of your work, and I've always found your comments and insights very fascinating. Obviously, with myself coming from an osteopathic background, there's some kind of resonance between the way I think of the body and the way you're trained to think of the body. But also I've noticed there's a number of differences as well, and I've learned a lot from reading your posts. So I'm really fascinated to learn, what was it that took you into Alexander technique in the first instance?
Well, this is interesting because I was an actor, and I was an actor kind of by default because it was the 60s and I hitched around and I didn't know what to do with my life.
Right.
And I wound up in Boulder, Colorado, in a production of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The director had been interested in me because I'd had some experience with my own mental illness. So he wanted me to be a consultant, and then he cast me in a role. And I thought, well, that's great. I'll do that. I get a lot of attention. And I did a little bit of university theater, and then I got into a little professional company. And one of the directors of the professional company had worked in France with Etienne Decroux. He was a teacher of Marcel Marceau, but Marceau doesn't represent what he did. What he did was really teach people how to control their movement.
Yeah.
To show, this all came from Francois Delsarte, which is also a link in Alexander. So at any rate, one of the, she wasn't a director, she was an assistant that was brought in to help us with movement. in this little theater company, this little government funded theater company. And she had studied in France with Etienne de Creux. And Etienne de Creux taught a lot of, he taught Gérard Depardieu, Jean-Louis Barrault, even Jessica Lange went and studied with him.
Oh wow. Okay.
So he was very, he had a certain amount of respect, but he was insane, really insane.
Right. Right.
And the idea being that you could you could control the body to control exactly what you wanted to express. This is a little bit like what we deal with in running. When you get in and try to position things and control things, you get into real trouble.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing when you're trying to express something as an actor. If you have the idea that you'll do a gesture that starts from your forehead and it will be intellectual, if it starts from your jaw, it'll be physical. This is all this stuff. And not only that, but the idea that if you're standing next to somebody and you rotate your head toward them, incline it toward them, and tilt it forward toward them, it says one thing that's affectionate. If you rotate it toward them, incline it away, and incline it back, it's completely different.
Right.
So at any rate, this stuff got very insane. I went to study with somebody who was teaching it and got into his company, and his company was completely abstract movement. This is a little bit what happened in modern art, that, they stopped painting Rembrandt characters and they just said, well, let's do line and color. And you took away the heart of it, took away the meat of it, and tried to just do the externals, like control your stride length. It's it's really analogous. There are things that will do themselves, and you shouldn't get in there and try to do them. And allowing them is another thing. So at any rate, I got terribly injured doing this work. I performed all over the world. I've been in Edinburgh and London and Paris, and by the time I was 32, I had a diagnosis of cervical arthritis.
Wow.
I had herniated discs. I had chronic bursitis of shoulders and knees. I had chronic tendonitis in the wrists and deltoids. I had arthritis in my hands. I was 32. And a rheumatologist told me I should take a year off and rest, so I got on my bicycle and rode 1,000 miles in 2 weeks. That was my response to that, which was okay for my knees, not for the neck.
Yeah, right.
At any rate, I left what I was doing, and I was sort of stumbling around in New York, and I had experienced FM Alexander when I was doing dance training. I did ballet training. Someone in the US was teaching these big group workshops, which I later learned was nonsense.
Right.
And so I knew who he was, and my wife, who's a dancer, was in New York, said, oh, you should come and take some Alexander lessons. And I said, oh, I did that. And she said, you really should. And I went, and it was a revolution. It was a revolution that, many people will have a handful of lessons and not feel a thing. And I'm sure you know this in your work.
Sure.
You see the difference, they don't. But for me, it was a revolution that I felt completely different. I felt open. I had an experience of my mother, it was very curious. Right. And I entered training right away. It was a 4-year full-time training, and I just signed right up. And all my problems went away. I'm 16.
And what year was this?
I started, it would have been 1985.
Right.
And I'm now almost 69. I don't have a problem with my neck, with my back. I run, I ski. I don't have anything that hurts anywhere. I don't have any joint. I don't have any tendons, which is kind of like, considering that when I had those problems, I couldn't run at all. I had knee problems. I couldn't do anything. Except ride my bike 1,000 miles.
Yeah.
So
brilliant.
So yeah, that's some of the story, and there's a ton more.
Yeah, sure. So that's how you got into the training, and so then, I mean, I know from reading a bit about you that you set up the Manhattan Center for Alexander Technique. Now, was that shortly after you trained, or was that a little while into your career?
That was just the name I gave to my studio.
Yeah.
I was teaching, as Alexander should be taught, I was teaching private individual lessons So to call it the Manhattan Center for the Alexander Technique was something to put on. In those days, there was no internet, so you just went around tacking up photocopies. So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Manhattan Center for the Alexander Technique, you had to say something because Lawrence Smith means nothing.
Sure.
And so I'd go around to dance schools and tack up these little flyers.
Excellent. And so, where did this lead you in terms of, obviously I know you were in that kind of acting world, and I know also from reading your various posts over the years and a bit on your website that you've worked with a whole range of different performers, from athletes to ballet dancers to
Yeah, yeah.
musicians. So where did your career kind of go from there? Were you straight in with that crowd, or did it take a while to build that reputation and that kind of client base up?
Well, in Manhattan, the Alexander Technique is very well known. Like in
Right.
London, it's taught at Juilliard. Actors all know about it. I taught the dancers from Jose Limon Company, Martha Graham. They would come, and that was sort of easy. And then I moved to Montreal. My wife is from Quebec.
Mm,
I had a son who'd had heart surgeries, and we couldn't pay the $1,000 a month health insurance to
right.
make sure he was okay.
Yeah.
Seriously, $960 a month. So we
Wow.
moved to Montreal, which is a great place. And the Alexander Technique is relatively unknown. To this day, it still is.
Mm,
And most of my students were people who had problems from sitting at the computer.
mm, mm.
Or they're curious. A Chinese physician who wanted to learn how to lecture better.
Right.
But it wasn't, and I would go and give workshops at some of the dance schools, but nobody's interested in taking private lessons.
Yeah.
It's very much a French thing, right? That this
Mm,
master disciple thing doesn't really work. They like Feldenkrais, they like group stuff,
right. Right.
which is fine.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know that Feldenkrais adopted some of Alexander's techniques, or at least I've seen you explain that to some degree. So could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, Moshe Feldenkrais was an Israeli
Mm,
uh, uh, martial artist who blew
mm,
out his knees and traveled around the world trying to find a solution to that. And he
right.
landed in London and studied with Alexander, one of Alexander's students, Walter
Right.
Carrington, briefly. And then he wrote his big book.
Mm.
And when Carrington brought it to Alexander, Alexander thought, well, he's taken all my ideas.
Ah,
Give me
okay.
credit. And he called Feldenkrais in and said, what do you have to say about this? And Feldenkrais said, well, you're not a known. Alexander said, you shall have no more lessons.
Oh,
And
wow.
he sent him back to Israel. And Feldenkrais built something different. He didn't know the Alexander technique. He kind of
Yeah.
faked a bit of it. But
Hmm.
what he did was perfectly respectable in its way, but
Mm.
it didn't deal with core postural issues in the same way.
Right, right. So, well, tell us a bit more about Alexander, because I'm not sure of his exact sort of timeline of when he developed the technique, but I believe it's the early 20th century. Is that right?
Well, actually, he did. A lot of his story isn't well known because
Mm.
he didn't talk about a lot of it, right?
Right.
His parents were involved in agricultural rebellion in England and
Mm.
arrested and sent as convicts to Tasmania,
Right.
as were a lot of people. And this was right after the Brits had killed every single Aboriginal in Tasmania.
Oh gosh. Right.
They're complete genocide. They wiped them out. The ones they didn't kill, they swept off and put in an island where they died of, diseases that they hadn't been exposed to before. Anyway, that's another story.
Mm.
But Alexander was
Mm.
brought up on what they did. These convicts, because they couldn't leave Tasmania, they were given
Mm.
farms. So
Right.
instead of sitting in prison, they said, "Well, farm this land." And so his parents had a farm, and Alexander grew up on a farm, and he was somewhat sickly. This is also not too clear, but there a lot of time he wasn't in school, and he was playing with the horses and
Mm.
out running around on the farm. So he avoided a lot of the stresses of primary school education. As you know, the first time we really see kids' posture get bad, unless they've had an abusive home life, is hunching over desks.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And we see the evidence of the uh, moral reflex, startle reflex, grasping reflexes, holding on out of fear, and they take that pencil and grip it. And
Yeah.
so there's evidence that he escaped a lot of that. And then
Right.
later went from Wynard and moved to Melbourne, educated himself, and got interested in theater. And for him, theater was doing monologues, doing
Right.
Shakespearean monologues, and he lost his voice. And the physicians were not able to tell him what was wrong. And he said, "It must be something I'm doing." And they said, "Yeah, that's it." So he set up this three-way mirrors, and he studied himself for 9 years.
Oh wow.
This is a crazy person, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Who
Absolutely.
really
Yeah.
wanted to be on stage. And he saw things that he was doing, the way that he lifted his chest and pulled his head back when he took in a breath of air, preparing to project his voice.
Mm.
And he saw that when he tried to control that by positioning, he wasn't successful.
Mm.
That he had to really find another way of not. This is where it gets tricky, because there's a difference between if your shoulder is curled forward, pulling it back doesn't stop you from pulling it forward. It just adds
Right.
another tension to position it. And how do you stop the pulling it forward? And this is a tricky thing, because I'd say that the brain, the motor cortex, can do basically three things with a muscle.
Yeah.
It can excite it and shorten it.
Mm-hmm.
It can isometrically contract it, just hold it in a position, or it can inhibit it, lengthen it. And that's an active thing. And
Yeah.
so the ability to think in a way that lengthens a muscle is a very tricky thing, because you can't directly address the muscles. So for him, it was a matter of really a Zen process of sitting there saying, okay, leave yourself alone. Don't try to do anything. No stimulus to that you're going to contract to trying to do something, and direct yourself to open. Let your head go forward and up. Let your back lengthen. He was not doing this at this point. This came
Right.
later. But whatever he did, he solved his vocal problems, and he had a career performing, and started being asked to teach. And he taught a breathing method, which people say was very much like Francois Delsarte. Francois
Right.
Delsarte, the Frenchman, Francois Delsaarte's brother was in Australia at the time. So
Right.
he was the origin of all that to crew stuff, of turn your head to the right to indicate this,
Right.
So what Alexander was teaching in groups was not really the Alexander technique. It was a breathing method. And over years teaching it, he I think, he obviously got frustrated that people weren't doing what he wanted, and he started taking hold of them.
Yeah.
And he realized that was a delicate process, that you could touch, as you know, as an osteopath, that you can impart some information to somebody through touch. That's not the same thing as pulling them and pushing them. It's
Sure.
quite subtle. And once he had a method for working on people to get them to stop doing all this unconscious stuff, he wrote that it was wrong to directly try to control any aspect of respiration. The respiration was a reflex, and that if global posture was functioning well, the breathing would be fine. And here again, we come to the problem with running, because running is reflex.
Yeah.
It's not learned. You don't look at somebody to do it. Kids simply do it. So then if you tell somebody, well, you should hold your elbows at 45 degrees, or your torso should be straight, you're not going to make it better.
Right. Yeah.
And this is a real difficulty, and it's why I think barefoot running has kind of died out. Fortunately, it hasn't completely. We can still buy our
Yeah, yeah.
our barefoot shoes.
That's it. That's it. Yeah, fascinating stuff. Now, one of the things that struck me as you were explaining the background to Alexander there is that he didn't go through the standard educational process that a lot of kids do, which, of course, when you look at the schooling and the critiques of the schooling processes, especially in our Western cultures, is that they often say that really the schooling system was set up to create a population that would essentially be happy following instructions
Yes,
and
yes.
weren't designed to really think for themselves. So I thought that's quite fascinating that he, like several other leaders that come up with novel concepts, they often don't have a conventional training background or educational background, let's say, and there's something about that that seems to um, open their minds and let them see things from a different perspective. So that was really fascinating.
Well, then what was it that the philosopher Heijo Eckhart said? He said
Mm.
the chair is a political tool uh, designed to create a docile population.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. I haven't heard that before.
You put people in rows and chairs, and you got
Yeah,
them.
yeah,
But the other thing
yeah,
for me is uh, I always talk about moral reflex. The
yeah.
physicians will say that that disappears after a certain age, but I don't think it does. Then we call it
Well, should we just explain what that is for people that perhaps haven't heard of that before? I know
yeah,
a bit about it, but
yeah.
yeah, go on. Just sort of
Well,
elaborate.
it's a reflex that can be stimulated in young children and in apes. That when they're
Mm,
stressed, they reach out and grab onto something and then they retract. So
mm,
it's an ape holding onto its mother when the tiger comes, essentially,
yeah.
right? And it's
Mm,
a reflex, and it's not something that is we seek to eradicate
mm,
but it's rarely appropriate in our world. So the child who is hunched over at his desk, gripping his pencil, is afraid. He's
mm-hmm.
afraid of not succeeding. He's afraid of not getting a good grade. And these, whatever you want to call them, these grasping reflexes are strongly stimulated.
Yeah.
And when they are successful, the brain will eventually assume them as part of posture.
Mm,
So he gets a good grade contracting like that, or he plays his violin well,
mm-hmm.
contracting like that. And the brain says, let's just do that all the time. So, like
Right.
other postural muscle actions, it's 24/7. It doesn't just appear when he writes, it's always there.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things that I've read about around the Moro reflex is that, of course, it's very much linked in with breathing as well,
Mhm.
and when it's retained, it can impact on respiratory mechanics. Is that something that I guess you're alluding to there?
Well, yes, and this is an interesting thing because you can. I've recently had some disagreements with Alexander teachers about
Right.
this, and you'll know more about this than Alexander teachers because you've had a lot of anatomy. That the central tendon of aponeurosis of the diaphragm
Mm,
has strong ligaments attaching it to the cervical spine. The phreno-pericardial ligament, it's glued to the pericardium around the heart, which has two powerful ligaments that connect it to the neck. The only way it's going down is if you collapse. When there's
mm-hmm.
good respiration, as in all movement, spinal muscles are active first. So the spine extends on inhalation and the diaphragm can lift the ribs, not go plunging down into the abdomen. And
Right.
it's incredible in how many areas. Recently, Mark Cucasella,
Yes, I know him. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
he wrote about diaphragmatic breathing in running,
Mm.
which is a horror because
Right.
you ought to be extending. You've made diaphragmatic breathing in swimming. Now,
Mm-hmm.
come on, you're lengthening like crazy. The diaphragm,
Yeah.
it's just an absurdity.
Right, right. So when you say extending, we're kind of not just talking about sagittal plane extension, but like an axial extension. So actually lengthening the body. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And yeah, you know this better than anyone that uh, when we move, the movement starts in this upper neck and moves down the spine and out to the limbs. So you don't move a finger without some preparatory muscular action in the spine. And you
Mm,
see this with a weightlifter. He's lifting a heavy weight. He doesn't contract his arms. He lengthens like crazy against it,
mm, mm.
And in studying, and this was also in Born to Run. This was brought up
Right.
that four-legged running animals inhale on extension, and they
Yes.
can't alter it.
Mm-hmm.
So how is it that in the Alexander technique there are people touring the world telling people to shorten and widen on inhalation?
Right. Right.
It's a surprising thing. Or you've probably done yoga,
Mm-hmm.
belly breathing. I I,
Yeah.
I had the good luck to have an old Chinese Tai Chi teacher who said, "No, no, you no breathe like that."
Right. Right. Okay. Okay. So he had a kind of a version of Alexander in his sort of martial arts background. Is that right?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And he would say, and then people would say, "Well, should I direct my chi here?" He said, "Chi is smarter than you. It know where to
Yeah.
go. You
Yes.
open,
Exactly.
you
Yeah.
open
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
sinos. You leave chi alone."
Yeah. 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 That makes a lot of sense. Fantastic. So now obviously we've mentioned the Moro reflex, but one of the things that I've seen you write about a lot is this idea of postural reflexes, particularly, of course, because we've been on a running forum, you've often related that back to running. So, what have you been your insights and experiences with this whole idea of barefoot running, being able to feel the ground, the feet actually splaying on the ground
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
on, and how that affects the way the body moves uh, above the feet, as it were.
Well, let me say a little. Let me say a little bit more about my history,
Okay, yeah, go on.
because I did some running in the '70s, and then when I started all the ballet, I had knee problems. I couldn't run anymore for about 13
Mm.
years. And then when I was training in Alexander, I thought, well, maybe I could run now.
Yeah, yeah,
And, I had a doctor tell me I needed orthotics and all this stuff. And I went out running and I immediately felt myself picking up my toes as I picked my leg
right.
up. And I thought, well, why would I do that?
Mm.
Why would I pick my leg up? And I stopped doing it and I never had the knee problem again. After
Mm.
13 years of it, that I had when I started running, I was fine running in these Adidas SL 72, these nothing shoes.
Yeah,
And then
yeah,
I
yeah.
read Runner's World and How
Mm.
to Run, and I remember them saying, uh, "Land on your heel and roll through your foot."
Yeah.
And the way the shoes were made was they were beveled right in the middle.
Mm.
And so I thought, well, I should land on the middle of my foot and roll through my foot. Well, the only way to do that is to sort of lift the outside of your leg. And the
Interesting.
peroneus longus comes right up to the knee. So I was contracting this thing that
Mm.
shouldn't be active in running. And
Yeah.
and then I started. A friend of mine said, "Well, come to this race." I started running in Central Park races, and I started winning them in my age group.
Right.
Just doing nothing. I was running 25 miles a week and winning 10-kilometer races
Hmm.
just by leading with my head, letting my spine lengthen, letting letting the movement happen.
Mm.
You know,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
not doing any of the things that I'd read. And as I ran, the more I ran, the more I started running in racing flats. And people say you can't train in those, and I thought, well, I can run a hard 10K in them,
Mm.
and they're very minimal heel. So when the minimalist shoes came out, they were New Balance, and they still had a heel.
Right.
And I realized that to run in them, I had to be very far up on my toes, or my heel slammed down after my forefoot landed, which was
Yeah.
unpleasant. And one day I
Yeah.
was in the Dominican Republic, and I would get up in the morning and run 5 miles on the beach while the sand was still wet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I got about 5 miles out, and I had to go to the bathroom. The only way to get there was on asphalt.
Right.
And I went barefoot on asphalt, and I thought, wow, that's better than the sand. The
Yes.
solid
Funny that.
the solid response, people say, "Oh, you can't run on cement." Really? It's
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
easier than running in the grass, folks.
For sure. Well, Barefoot Ted says that, doesn't he? I think it's in the book Born to Run. He says that we kind of forget that the natural world is replete with all kinds of potential dangers for the bare foot. But when you run on asphalt, then suddenly he says it's like running on cream. It feels beautiful to
Yeah,
run on.
and
Um,
and there's a reflex in the Alexander technique that we talk about,
yeah.
which is the interosseous reflex of the
Mm,
positive supportive response.
right.
And it's a reflex that's stimulated when the weight is on the forefoot and the little muscles between the metatarsals are stretched.
Mm,
And the brain says, oh, everything's good. You can just lengthen now. You don't have to hold on. And
yeah.
it's tested in newborns. They push the ball
Mm,
of the foot and the leg extends.
right.
So once you're there, you're not gripping and holding on in the same way. You're more just kind of extending and flying.
And do you think that the lateral sort of border of shoes inhibits that? In a typical shoe, the foot can't splay so much as it lands, or is that
Yeah.
not part of?
Yeah, I absolutely
Yeah.
think that's true. I think that I take the laces out of the lower
Mm,
eyelets on my shoes so my metatarsal isn't messed with.
right.
You know, you don't
Right.
need something binding it to control it. And
Yeah.
another important thing, which you'll know more about than I do, is that there's a band of fascia underneath the foot, the plantar fascia,
Hmm.
which is passive support. When you're standing around, it's
Sure.
supporting your arch. But once you start running, you need muscles. You need toe flexors
Sure.
to take the place of the plantar fascia, or you just tear the plantar fascia.
Hmm.
And if you are landing on your heel and rolling forward, you're just ripping that plantar fascia. If you land on the ball of your foot, your toe flexors are activated and they insert halfway up the calf.
Mm,
So they're parallel to the Achilles tendon. So they're huge assist to the
yes.
tendon and the gastrocnemius. And these people start barefoot running and they get tendonitis. Well,
Mm.
maybe they're putting their heels down.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. And one of the things that you were just alluding to, and I appreciate you may not have finished your description yet, but it reminded me of again the Born to Run book, and I can't remember the name of the coach that went down to watch the Tarahumara run, but he was one of these elite running coaches that went down to the race that's covered in the book,
Yeah,
and he observed the Tarahumara running, and what one of his most sort of striking realizations were that these guys were running with smiles on their faces. And, it just strikes me that, first of all, as we know, there's less muscle activation required to smile than there is to look miserable. So that's one thing. But also, a smile is a kind of upward lift. It creates levity in the body, both emotionally but also physically. And I'm just wondering, if that might be there might be a correlation there between
yeah,
what you're describing and what he observed in
yeah.
those
Alexander,
runners.
Alexander said, "Have a smile on your face." He said, when you're
Right.
having lessons, first of all, see something, which means the
Hmm.
eyes are moving. The saccades of the
Yes.
eyes. If the image isn't moving on the retina, you don't really see it. That's how we can see people are out of focus.
Yeah.
We can see their eyes aren't moving. Well, he also said that it was important that you have a pleasant thought so that the temporal muscles, lift the face, and that was
Mm.
important to how the suboccipital muscles and the head sits on the. He didn't go into it. He just said, "Have a
Sure.
smile."
Right.
And, the thing is, it's a little bit like one of the interesting things about running in the woods is that you're looking around. You stay lively. Your feet are
Yes.
feeling the ground. Your eyes are seeing. You're
Hmm.
balancing. Everything is mobile. When you're
Yeah.
in the city and everything looks like shit and you don't want to look at it and you put on headphones,
Yeah. Yeah.
you can kind of disrupt a lot of little lively mobility. All the sensors are comparators.
Mm.
So in order to sense you're moving, muscles are changing length. This is what good posture is.
Right. Yeah. It's dynamic.
When posture is good, opposing muscles are changing length. It's called myotatic reflex, right? That one is
Hmm.
lengthening, the other is shortening, and they alternate. And having
Sure.
opposing muscles set against each other, not a good thing. So there's something about out in the woods, it looks good. You're looking around, your feet are responding to the ground.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Where I know, I ride my bike to teach at McGill,
Mm,
and I don't want to look at anything. And I catch
sure.
myself at the stoplight watching the numbers count down until the light changes. And
Mm.
I have to shake my head and say, come on, there's something to look at, Jack. It's.
Yeah, 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 exactly. Well, interesting enough, one of my mentors is a guy called Phil Beach, who I interviewed a couple of podcasts back. I think you might quite enjoy his podcast actually. So I'll send you the link. But he describes running on trails, and he is someone who's run barefoot certainly since the 90s, and but he describes it as being like a kind of nutrition for the body, and how all of the different contours and cambers and textures and so on, there it creates a real neuromuscular kind of nutrition for the body. Whereas running on a treadmill, for example, or and we can maybe dive into that a little bit later, because of course that messes with the reflexes as well. But also just running on roads and on pavements and so on, they are more like fast food. He kind of makes the analogy, it's like fast food because it burns calories, but it gives you no other nutrition, just like fast food gives you calories, but there's no other nutrition associated with it. And I think that links back into what you were saying about using the eyes to look around and to assess this kind of very variable terrain that you're running over when you're trail running. So one of the things I used to teach, which actually ties in a bit with Grakovetsky's theory of the spinal engine, which I
Mhm.
know we had said we would probably have a chat about. But one thing I used to say was that when you're running along barefoot and you're making this transition to barefoot, get someone who's been shod their whole life, like most of us have, and sometimes that transition can be a little bit bumpy for them. And I used to say to them, you know, if you're running in the woods, you should absolutely be able to focus on the ground and tell from a reasonable distance away whether the thing you see, let's say 15, 20 meters away, is a stick or a snake. Like, if you're not sure whether
Yeah.
that's a stick or a snake and you're running, and you get within 10 meters, that's too late.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
by the time you've actually stopped and corrected your direction, you could be in serious trouble. And what Grakovetsky talks about with his whole spinal engine theory is the idea that as you're running along, these ground impact forces are coming up through the legs, and they are spinning each level of the spine, each segment of the spine, as the kind of loading goes into, let's say, the L5S1 facet. Then it spins that facet round a little bit. That then knocks onto the next facet, and it goes all the way up to the spine. And he says by the time it reaches the head, all force should be dissipated. And the point there being that, of course, essentially your head is riding without any impact, and that means that you can see clearly, right? So I always used to say, look, if you're finding it difficult, if you're running in the city and you're finding it difficult to read number plates on cars or perhaps road signs, but more importantly, if you're running on a trail and you can't tell whether that's a snake or a stick before you're right upon it, then there's something wrong with the running technique, and it's an indication you need to kind of do some homework and get back to a more smooth gait, let's say.
Yeah. And I think one of the problems with uh, running barefoot in the city on the sidewalk is that
Mm.
you can't see glass until you're very close to it. So
Mm-hmm.
instead of having that long view and noticing rock or branch, you're looking
Yeah.
down at your feet, and this is not such a good thing. This is why,
Mm.
Merrill vapor gloves are my
Yeah.
city shoe.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Of course.
another thing that I'll tell my students when I'm working with my students, and my hands on them, and I'm on their neck and arms, and they have a tendency to focus inward and
Mm.
try to fix something. And I have to always say, see around you, feel around you, listen. Then your extremities are mobile. If your extremities are mobile, if your fingers can read braille, your shoulder's probably freeing too. Everything, the finger is leading the hand, and you don't read braille with a clutched up hand. I don't think so. And
Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah.
a great thing with barefoot running is that, and it is why that people, I've had runners who were on. Their parents brought them to me. They were on a high school track team, and I said, "Well, let's go out front and run down the street." and a
Hmm.
big smile on their face. It
Yeah,
just
yeah.
feels so good. And here's the danger, right?
Mm.
Because it feels good and you're not ready to do it. And you,
That's it. That's it. Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
think my experience was going into it somewhat slowly, but I
Mm.
had enough knowledge to know that a tendon like the Achilles tendon can be very rigid if it's not used in an elastic way. And
Sure.
for it to change, to develop more elastic fibers, isn't overnight. So
Hmm.
people start barefoot running, they think, oh, I have Achilles tendonitis. And really, it's changing.
Hmm.
And, give it a little massage and back off. And don't, if you run 50 miles a week with shoes and then you take them off and run 50 miles a week, you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah,
But
yeah, for sure.
isn't it a hard thing for people? I say, do this 2 minutes at a time at first. Take the
Yeah.
shoes off, run on, put them back on, forget about
Hmm.
it.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Well, I think you're aware that we distributed the Vibram Five Fingers to the UK for 10 years. I stopped that in 2017, but for that 10-year period, obviously I was very heavily involved in both the sort of commercial side, but also educating a lot of the distributors around the world, and of course keeping up to speed with the research and so on. But also, of course, interacting with the users. And it was a very common thing to find that people would put on a pair of Five Fingers, or indeed they might just decide they were going to go the full sort of hog, and I think it's the whole hog is the right the right phrase,
Yeah.
and go completely barefoot. And the thing with it is that for most people, it does feel great. It feels much lighter. They feel like there's more spring in their step, as you were just alluding to with the toe flexors and the interosseous reflex. I think that's part of what makes them feel lighter. And then, of course, they go and run. Sometimes not even for as long as they used to, but even further than they used to, because they feel so light on their feet. And then, of course, as you say, the adaptation just isn't there, especially for the connective tissues. We always used to say
Yeah.
that your nervous system will adapt almost instantaneously, because you take your shoes off and run on something hard. For most people, they will switch straight to a forefoot or a midfoot strike. The nervous system kind of knows what to do. But the muscular system, that's going to take a good few weeks to adapt, because now you're loading the system in a different way to the way it's been used to being loaded, particularly in the calf area. Of course, this eccentric loading of the calf muscles. Um, but then, of course, the connective tissues like the Achilles tendon, like the plantar fascia, they are going to take a lot longer to adapt, because they're slow adapting tissues, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but we had a lot of people that just didn't heed that advice, unfortunately.
Well,
So,
it's interesting. You mentioned Grakovetsky, and I write about him, but
mm.
I had a back and forth with him in exchange.
Did you? Yeah.
Yeah, where I said, I think you're wrong when you say that it's all right to land on the heel. Because
Yes.
you're not organizing the muscular chains through to the spine in the same way. You're just not.
Mm.
And the marvelous thing is that when you get that, your joints are relieved of so much stress
Yes.
when you distributed forces of running is jumping. You're going up and you're landing. It's not a heavy landing, but your weight is coming over the leg, and something's got to absorb that, and the muscles
Yes.
can absorb it.
Mm.
I say to people that say, "Oh, it's okay to put your heel down." I want to say, try a jumping rope. Let's just jump
Yes.
rope and put your
Exactly.
see how that works
Exactly.
for you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's fascinating, isn't it? One of the analogies that I use when people like to heel strike as they run, because you can see these graphs, can't you, with what's called the impact transient, which is that
Yeah,
kind of sharp
yeah,
spike that occurs on the heel strike. And the analogy I use is a bit like pole vaulting. So you're putting your leg out in front of you, like the pole, and then you're vaulting over the heel, which is okay, but the point is that you're going to get a jar, and that's what the impact transient is. That's the
yeah,
same jar that you get as you thrust the pole into the ground, and
yeah,
then you vault over the top of your heel. And what we know is that impact transient is correlated with several of the stress injuries in the lower leg. And as you've just alluded to, it's in most instances it's probably not the way the nervous system would choose to
yeah.
land, unless it's been trained or detrained into doing it.
Well, I've written and spoken a lot about how you shouldn't really land on your foot. When people say
Mm,
land under your center of gravity, and you look at
right.
Carl Lewis and his ball of foot is way the hell out in front. But
Mm,
that's because he's still going up. He's
mm,
still in the upper arc of his stride. The leg comes through. The leg, if it's not held, falls to the ground. And first
mm.
the weight of the leg is taken and the weight of the body comes over it. So there's no bam. Like
Yes.
heel striking, there's not really any way around it. And then,
Yeah.
then, then when people will say, "Oh, you land on the ball of foot and it's okay to put the heel down," really, I don't
Sorry,
think.
it's okay to. I missed that. Can you say that again?
Well, that there are plenty of runners running teachers who will say, "Yes, land on the ball of your foot, and then you can put your heel down."
Right.
But the whole point of getting weight on the ball of the foot is to prepare the muscles for extension.
Yes.
And
Yes.
as you
Exactly. Yeah.
come over, they're prepared. It's jumping rope. It's exactly jumping rope. That
Yeah.
not as alarmingly fast.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
surprised as I'm old and my health isn't good and I run really slowly. I used to run in Central Park and no one would pass me.
Right.
Now chubby little girls pass me, and I sort of have to live with that and say, well, you're running. And
Yes.
it's still the same thing, even though my stride is uh, not as long, not as extended. I still don't really have a moment to put my heel down.
Mm,
It's,
yeah.
it's really not there.
Sure. Sure. Now, one of the things you were just talking about, which reminded me of a lady that I know called Angela Kane. Unfortunately, she died a few years back, but she ran a website which is called voicetraining.co.uk, and she had written a book called Voice Gym, and she essentially had been in that field of professional singing, and she was taught, I believe, to sing with her tongue low in her mouth. There were various. You have to excuse the detail because I'm not really an expert in this field, but essentially the way she had been taught to sing and her whole mission was to change this. She believed had driven a TMJ issue for her, and the TMJ issue itself had caused her a lot of pain, a lot of emotional challenges, and to the extent that she actually got sectioned. And this is when she was a young mother, and so she was unable to bring her kids up, and so it was a very traumatic experience for her. And it was her who managed to work out that this was all driven by a jaw joint issue, and that the jaw joint issue was almost certainly driven by the way she'd been trained to sing. And she had concluded that you know some of the key ways that you needed to um, utilize to optimize TMJ function was to smile, to lift the outer corners of the eyes, in particular using that temporalis muscle, that anterior fibers of a temporalis, um, and essentially to create this levity, this upward lift through the body. And I'm sure she probably read some Alexander technique, but I was just kind of interested to relate that back to what you were saying earlier and see what your thoughts were on that.
Well,
Have you worked much with TMJ issues? I know you've worked a lot with singers.
a little bit. And
Mm,
and one thing that I think is interesting is Alexander always used an exercise called the whispered ah,
right.
which was in which you have a little smile to lift the
Mm,
muscles you're talking about. You let the jaw sort of drop open,
mm,
and it'll cause a reflex in breath. You're preparing
mm,
to say ah, but you're not thinking about it. You just and it always made me think, and you'll be able to answer my questions about this because we're always talking about the suboccipital muscles being primary
mm,
and the nerves that feed them being. But what about the muscles around the skull and the
mm.
temporal muscles? I mean, can you not harden the skull,
Absolutely. Yeah.
without hardening the neck?
Mm.
But
No, you can't.
I've had people come to me with temporal mandibular joint syndrome,
Mm,
and the doctors want them to sleep with a. And usually we just do the Alexander technique and it resolves. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah.
Just working on allowing yourself to lengthen, thinking of your bones moving apart, not placing anything,
Hmm.
and it's always tended to. I have a kid coming tomorrow night. Actually, a doctor wanted him to sleep with a device, and he's a teenager, and there's nothing wrong with his jaw. But I don't really know about the. I guess the nerves that innervate the temporal muscle also are coming out to suboccipital.
Well, yeah, the interesting thing is that those muscles, so the TMJ muscles, the muscles of the lips and tongue, the muscles of the eyes, but also the muscles that turn the head. So, in particular, sternocleidomastoid
Mhm.
and trapezius, they're all innervated by cranial nerves. So these are nerves that are coming direct from the brain stem itself. They
Right,
haven't actually come out through the foramen magnum and into the spinal cord.
right.
They're coming direct from the brain. So when you talk about them perhaps being more primary than the suboccipitals, I think you've got a good point there. It would seem to make sense. And I often think that one really useful way to try and understand these things is to look back to both the embryology, the evolutionary anatomy as well, but also how the child develops. And of course, these cranial nerves, they are retained right the way back through evolution into fish. And this is something that Phil Beach, who I mentioned earlier, he discusses this in some detail in his book and a little bit in the podcast as well. But some of those nerves just aren't present in fish. So some nerves, like, for example, the accessory nerve that feeds sternocleidomastoid and trapezius, that's not present because they don't have a neck. Fish don't have necks. but the cranial nerves that feed the jaw and feed the eyes, well, they're really ancient and deeply embedded structures that are very fundamental. Then you look at how our system develops as an embryo and into early childhood. And of course, what the child gains control of first is its eyes. So it doesn't gain control of its neck or its
Yeah,
hands
yeah.
or that kind of thing first. It's the eyes and the jaw, so it can feed, so it can breastfeed, and so it can look around the room. But then as it starts looking, then this kind of reflex, this optic, what's it called? It's called an oculomotor, or rather, sorry, an oculocervical reflex.
Yeah,
So the eyes, yeah, the eyes initiating the movement of the neck.
yeah.
Um, then that starts coming to play, and then the neck starts to come online. So, and of course, the neck is online before the rest of the spine is online, and then the hands, you start to get control of the hands, and the last thing is that the legs and the feet come online, as it were.
But
Go on.
on the other hand, when you talk about the eyes,
Mm,
the saccades of the eyes that move them back and forth when you're focused
mm.
are affecting the suboccipital muscles. You know that it tells somebody
Yes,
the
yes,
car drives by and you don't just follow it with your eyes. The head comes along. It's very hard to prevent it. So I'd like to
absolutely,
think
yeah.
if there's that mobility in the focused eye, then maybe there's that mobility in the neck. In the same way that people may have a problem with the jaw muscle,
Mm,
but that may have fed back from something they're doing elsewhere. They may not be, you know what I mean? Like somebody has a tight trapezius, they're
yes,
not tightening the trapezius, they're
sure.
gripping with the hand.
Mm,
So what is the thing you do? You let go of the trapezius, or do you open the hand? And the trapezius
yes.
says, "Oh, okay." I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
it's so much the case with barefoot running. Liberate the toes,
Mm,
liberate the eyes, and the system. You allow the system its full mobility. The sensors are all comparators.
mm-hmm.
Without movement, we have no balance. The head has to
Yeah.
oscillate. So that stuff is all. I mean, going barefoot is a pretty important thing.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I agree. I agree. And there's so many different ways we could go with that. One of the things that Phil Beach talks about is the idea that of course, the feet are hugely sensitive and very large on the cortical map, on the sensory map in the cortex,
Yeah,
and that the soles of the feet, of course, are feeding information directly into the low part of the spine. So the nerves that innervate the soles of the feet are L4, L5, and S1, and that's that kind of key junctional area right at the base of the spine where most of the forces that are going up the legs as you run, and the downward forces coming from the head, arms, and trunk, they're all meeting at that L4, L5, S1, and the sacroiliac joints. And so the soles of the feet are really telling that part of the spine what it is that you're running over. So that's another kind of key reason that it's so important to actually feel through the feet and use them as these sensory organs that they are. So now, Lawrence, I don't know if now's a good time to talk about the uni versus biarticular muscles. Things we've talked a bit about gaits, and certainly in my osteopathic training, there wasn't a lot of focus on this idea of uni versus biarticular muscles. I'd read a bit around it and a few different concepts around, of course, the uni articular muscles being more stabilizer based, and the biarticular ones or polyarticular ones being more mobilizer based. But I know that you have some thoughts on this. So could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, as many Alexander teachers are very influenced by the work of George Cudgel,
Mm-hmm.
who studied the origins of locomotion in vertebrates. And he studied
Right.
salamanders, ablastoma, because their egg cell is clear and you could see them start to swim before they hatch. And the swimming
Right.
was undulatory spinal movement. And then when they develop limbs, the spinal movement is still initiating the movement of the limbs, just like humans, babies crawling. Their
Yes.
pelvis and shoulder girdle are doing this this alternate side to side movement to it.
Yeah.
So it's not just an arm moving forward; it's the spine.
Mm.
But once the salamander starts to actually walk, the contact with the ground influences everything back, feeds
Right.
everything back. Like Rakovetsky said that
Mm.
the the uh, the reflexes in the hand that take the body's weight tell the body how to respond to that point of contact. In running,
Yes.
what do you have to do to extend off the foot? Well, you don't do it. It kind of
Yeah.
does itself as the weight goes over it. And the brain says, "Okay, we got to put this much work into it." And
Mm.
well, you'll know much more about the anatomy of it than I do. But um, what was the point of this? I
Oh,
must.
it was the uni versus
Oh
biarticular
yeah,
muscle.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
No. It seems it's fairly obvious that running animals don't have big lower legs. A
Mm.
deer,
Yeah.
everything is the butt. And the
Yeah.
humans, when those Kenyan runners came out, they had no legs at all. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not efficient to use a muscle that's far from the spine to do your work. You want
Yeah.
it close to the heart, you want it close to the spine.
Mm.
So we've evolved limbs to extend the movements of the spine.
Mm.
And therefore, in pure straight ahead running, the muscles of the legs have nothing to do with generating the action. They
Yeah.
behave like tendons. If you simply had tendons there, you could do a very basic run.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you have a muscle that crosses two joint, like the quadriceps,
Yeah.
and you fold the hip and the knee, that muscle hasn't changed length.
Mm-hmm.
Same with the hamstrings. You fold the knee and the hip, it hasn't changed length. Same with gastrocnemius if you include the foot in that.
Yes.
So the powerful muscles of the glutes, influenced or directed by the muscles of the spine, do the work, which isn't to mean the quads don't work, but they're not shortening or lengthening. So,
Yeah.
I was amused when I started running again to get to races and everyone is stretching their hamstrings. And I
Yes.
thought,
Yeah. Yeah.
gee, a natural activity like running, why don't dogs and cats stretch their hamstrings? Why would the hamstrings get tight?
Yeah.
And I stopped stretching altogether. I'd hurt myself a lot stretching in ballet,
Mm.
and it didn't make any difference. And again, stretching your calves, that sort of push against the wall thing,
Mm.
really? And
Yeah.
I realized those muscles aren't doing the work. They're
Right.
not doing the work. And what I should do after a race is do a nice cool down and run around the block.
Yeah.
But stretching them, And so I haven't stretched in, oh man, I haven't stretched in over 30 years.
Yeah, yeah.
And
It's
am I tighter? Then would it be good for me? If I used to squat a lot, I probably wouldn't be as sort of bound as I am. But if you know very well that if you run, you don't want sloppy muscles.
That's right.
You need a fairly tight uh, organization around the knee. And
Yes,
the
yes.
last thing you want to be doing is a lot of lotus position. It's overstretch your ligaments and
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I remember reading, I read a paper back in 1998. I was doing my master's degree, and it was the first paper that I'd read, which was actually really questioning the whole idea of stretching. And it was saying, and it wasn't just a theory paper. It was they'd conducted research, and what they were saying is that, of course, if you stretch a muscle, and I think they were looking at the calf muscles, and they were saying when you stretch the calf muscles, what happens is, of course, you lose some degree of stability at the ankle. You also find that you're becoming less efficient at running because you're not getting the recoil as quickly.
yeah.
Um, and because the calf isn't as tight, then you're having to recruit the calf more to stabilize the ankle. And essentially the list of reasons why it was a really bad idea to have good flexibility in your calf if you're a runner was quite extraordinary. And I was reading this thinking, oh my god, that's completely counter to everything that I've been trained and have read so far. Yet it all makes perfect sense. And then I was at a conference about 4 or 5 years later, which was a Football Association medical conference here in the UK, so soccer, of course. And they had done a prospective study on all of the Premiership teams. So these are the very top guys. And what they were particularly interested in was hamstring strain, because hamstrings are the most injured tissue in professional football. And so they had assessed the stiffness of the hamstrings in every single Premiership footballer at the beginning of the season. And then during the season, they essentially just waited to see who got hamstring strains, and these had to be reported in to the Football Association. And what they found was at the end of the season, the guys with the stiffest hamstrings had the least injuries, and the guys with the most mobile hamstrings had the highest level of injuries. And so, it's a, I mean, it's a bit counter narrative
Yeah.
to what we've been taught for many years and the way we've thought. But it's about essentially having a tissue that will recoil effectively and that will stabilize effectively and that has these spring mechanisms within them, but that isn't overly flexible.
I often, when I have beginning students and they talk about posture, I say there's a
Mm,
muscular network that's like a three-dimensional spider web.
mm,
And there's a little tension everywhere. If you put too much in one place, some areas will go slack. If you relax
yeah.
and you slacken some areas, others have to take it up. So there's kind of like a nice outward tension that binds you together. And if you
Mm,
relax, you're going to work too hard somewhere.
mm, mm.
So
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Now, another thought that sprung to mind when you were just describing the whole thing around uni and biarticular muscles was this idea. You mentioned that, of course, pretty much, well, any animal in nature, it has its muscle mass towards the hip or
yeah,
shoulder joint,
yeah,
and less in the arm or thigh, and even less in the forearm or lower leg. And of course, from a physics perspective, that makes sense. But also, I used to explain, because this is something that I've seen a lot in the rehabilitation world, is this idea that when people overpronate, which of course we know is much less likely to happen when you're forefoot striking. In fact, it's pretty difficult to overpronate when you forefoot strike, but it is somewhat possible still. Um, and so often the approach that's used there is to get people trying to activate the intrinsic muscles of the feet and to do all kinds of crazy things like picking up
mhm,
towels with their toes and this kind of thing. Now, that's presumably the way I see that is that the rehabilitation specialist is trying to build up the muscles in the feet to stop this overpronation.
yeah.
But I imagine that you would have quite a different take on that. So what's your
Well,
view on that side
not
of things?
not really. At some point, Um, it's at some point when I was in New York, I had it was to get health insurance. I had a physical, and I went to the doctor, and he said, "Well, I hope you brought your sneakers. You got to run the treadmill." And I said, "No, I didn't. I'll just run barefoot." And I wasn't a barefoot runner then. But I thought it's a treadmill. Why not? And he had me 18 minutes on the treadmill because my resting heart rate was 37. I was fit, you know.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And about a week later, my plantar fascia started to hurt, and I had plantar fasciitis in both feet. And I went to see the leading running podiatrist in New York, and he said, "Oh, your feet are collapsing. You need these rigid orthotics." And I said, "Really? Really?" And I thought about it. And you know what I did? I couldn't run. I could roller ski. I could cross country roller ski. That was
Right.
fine.
Yeah.
And so I kept doing that. And then I was in Montreal, and I said, well, I need to strengthen the muscles of my toe flexors so that I'm not tearing my plantar fascia. And I
Right.
went out and I did uphill repeats.
Okay.
I just ran uphill. That was it. That was all she wrote. It got better, went away. So the
Right.
idea of strengthening the toe flexors isn't dumb, but you need to strengthen them in the action that you're going to do.
Well, exactly. I suppose that was what I was pointing to a little bit.
Not
Is that
curling up newspaper. Go out
yes?
and
Yeah.
go out and do a little uphill run. This is really nice,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Absolutely.
you don't. Yeah, I had another experience. Well, this is to talk about me anyway, so I shouldn't feel bad about it. But
No,
I
that's
was
fine.
I was teaching a workshop in Switzerland to Alexander teachers on running. I'm the big shot. I figured out the barefoot running. So the one guy said, well, I'm running up the mountain today and I'm running down. How do you run downhill? And I said, well, you don't want to lean back. You want to, you're running downhill and you want to incline your torso forward so that when your leg recovers, it recovers low. It's pointing down. You don't have as far to drop. And I explained it to him and everything. And he came back the next day and said, wow, that's really great. That really helped me. So I got back to Montreal and I'm running downhill on a trail on Montreal and I'm noticing my feet. And the right one lands on the forefoot and rolls in a little and comes back nicely. And the left one sort of landed on the outside and stiffly flies out. I wasn't doing what I was teaching. I wasn't allowing the pronation. So I said, Lawrence, allow the pronation. Bam. Bone shifted in my foot. I could barely walk. I went to see a doctor who said, oh, you've dislocated something. You need, blah, 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 blah. You're never going to be able to run again. Seriously.
Oh wow.
And I thought, well, no. All I did was stop holding on. Why should that be so bad? And it didn't hurt if I walked on the outside of my foot. It hurt if I rolled in a lot. And I said, well, so be it. Let it hurt. And I insisted. I could barely walk to the corner. It was really painful. All of a sudden, one day, it was fine. It was just fine. And I put my shoes on, and I realized that my left foot had been a half size smaller than my other foot ever since I had to get soccer shoes to play soccer in junior high school. And it was the same size. It was the same size. So why was I holding on to it? I have no idea what I did, what kind of injury I had. But that was at age 62.
Right.
Which tells you something. You can
It
change.
does.
And
Yeah.
that's my really good foot now.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Well,
as far as being a smart ass and telling, well, it's an interesting thing about teaching because maybe you listen to yourself.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the quotes that I like to remind myself of. There's a guy called David White who I listen to from time to time. He's actually a poet, but he also works in the corporate world and goes in and kind of talks about these big company dynamics, but using kind of classical poetry. He'd probably be quite up your street, I expect. But he says that the art of poetry is overhearing yourself saying things you didn't know you knew. And
I have one.
I kind of think it's the same with teaching, right? It's kind of you say something, or someone asks you a question, you think, oh, okay, I need to find something here. So you start speaking and you gradually unload a little bit of knowledge and you unpack the thing, and then suddenly something comes and you're like, So that's it. And you're like, oh, okay, I didn't know I knew that.
You,
But
you,
actually, that does make sense.
you know what?
So,
You know what the playwright Ionesco said? He
no,
said,
no.
"I write to find out what I think."
Yes, there you
And
go.
all
Exactly.
of my silly writing on running was when I was out running and thinking about stuff and trying to work it out, and I'd come back and
Mm,
I'd write it down.
right, right.
And so I had gradually had all this stuff. I wasn't trying to build a theory. I was
Mm-hmm.
trying to work out what's happening here. And then at some point, I had a student who I sent the stuff to a publisher who was going to do a book. And my
Mm.
student said, "Oh, you need an illustrator. Why don't you just put it on WordPress?"
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
said, "Yeah, yeah." Because then I can go in and every now and then I'll write something really dumb,
Right.
like Gordo. You know Gordo on the.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yes, I wrote something about running on the treadmill that was
Mm-hmm.
totally wrong
Right.
about the motor of the treadmill doing some work for you. He
Mm-hmm.
said, "No, it really, look at Einstein talking about walking on a train. And once the
Mm.
train's moving, walking forward and back is not affected by the motion of the train. Relativity. It's basic
Mm.
relativity theory." And he said,
Yeah.
"No, no, it's not true. You don't have a wind resistance, but the motor's not doing any work for you."
Mm. Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Interesting.
So I took that down right away. That was really
Yeah. But interesting, it does change the reflex patterns because you're going from a essentially when you move over stuff, you're using a righting reflex, but when something moves underneath you, you're using a tilting reflex. And of course, the treadmill is moving underneath you, so it does change the reflexes. And also, there's an interesting concept. I don't know if you've heard of the group from Prague called, their system is called Dynamic Neuromuscular Stimulation, I think, DNS. But this guy Kolar or Collage, I think is how you pronounce it. He talks about what's called the punctum fixum, and I don't know if that's a standard medical or anatomical term, but essentially what he's alluding to is the joint that's fixed versus the joint that's moving around, or the bone that's fixed versus the bone that's moving around the joint. So when you think of treadmill running, then essentially it's the hip that's fixed in space. It's not really changing position, and the foot is moving underneath the hip, and it's kind of going in a cyclical pattern underneath the hip. But it's the hip that is essentially the most stable joint. But when you're running over land, then the foot becomes the punctum fixum when it's on the ground, because everything's moving about the foot. And then when you're in the air, of course, the dynamics change.
I
But
got,
so
I
what?
don't. This is where Gordo corrected me,
Mm,
and I don't really agree with you.
you don't? Okay, okay.
Imagine the treadmill is uh, 20 feet wide and 100 feet long.
Mm-hmm.
The belt's moving under you, and then you run on it. It's like the earth turning. The way that you run on it is not. Once you begin running, once you've overcome inertia, it doesn't matter that the belt is moving against you. You're not doing anything different. You're
Mm-hmm.
running in relation to the belt,
Yes,
not
yeah, I
in
can see
relation.
that.
And for me, the problem was, and I've done some barefoot running on treadmills. For me,
Mm,
the problem is that it's psychologically, you're not looking around. Things aren't
mm-hmm.
moving. Your eyes are, you're looking at a TV screen maybe.
Mm.
But the rails restrict your arm movement.
Yes, yeah.
And when I've seen a video of myself running on a treadmill, my foot is almost coming off the back of the treadmill. It's not
Yes,
big.
yes.
It's not long enough. It's not wide
Mm-hmm.
enough. When you're
Mm.
running, you're not running in that straight a line. You're you're
Yeah, yeah.
you're wobbling around, going back and forth. And a
Mm-hmm.
big thing is the arm movement. Is that it's not so good to restrict your arm movement. I mean,
Yeah,
I mean, so many
yeah,
runners talk about holding the arms, but when you initiate running or walking, you don't do
yeah.
it with the arms.
Yeah.
The head, the spine, the legs, and the arms come in as an afterthought, but they ought to hang I think you look at great sprinters, you look at Carl Lewis,
Mm.
his arm is completely straight behind him and it comes up, it's not like, but then there are runners, then there's, and people will always say, well, what about Michael Johnson? Well, Michael Johnson was
Yes, of course.
he was a bad runner who was stronger than everybody else. And eventually he burned out his hamstrings and lower back. And it's the
Yeah,
same thing when
yeah,
you look at tennis, you look at Roger Federer. Well, that's kind of a miracle that you're playing that game with your reflexes as intact. And why does Nadal beat him? Because he's strong, because he's
yeah,
seeing the ball sooner, not because he's using himself better. He's gripping and grunting. And
yeah.
Alexander used to say that just because you use yourself well doesn't mean you're going to be necessarily better at doing what you're doing.
Sure, sure. Yeah, Nadal is always pulling his shorts out from between his butt cheeks, isn't he? Which is a sure sign that there's something not contracting optimally in that pelvic
Well,
floor region.
the poor guy has, is a bit of, uh, he's got a bit of a problem. He used to have all these tics of having to touch his forehead and pull his,
Yes, that's right.
not step on a line. And he's been able to control those.
Mm,
What I think is remarkable about him is he sees where you're going to hit the ball before you hit it.
right,
And
right.
that's the answer, right?
Mm,
And it's
mm-hmm,
why
yeah.
Federer is not that fast.
Mm-hmm.
But somebody in their service motion betrays where they're going, and he goes there. And
Yes. Yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah. But so, yeah, I mean, not to labour the point with the treadmill discussion, because I do see where you're coming from. I looked into this a fair bit at one point because I'd had a similar discussion with someone else, and one of the things I did was to look up a lot of the literature to see what it said. Treadmill versus overground running, and what seemed to be the case is exactly as you're saying, is that all the papers were saying, well, there's no substantial difference, therefore, it's totally acceptable to assess someone on a treadmill versus on the ground. It's not going to give you any additional sort of information. But when you dug into the papers, you could see that there were clear differences in the timings, because they often used EMG and this kind of thing to assess when different muscles were contracting. And sometimes they were out by as much as 20 or 30 milliseconds, which is quite a substantial difference. And
yeah,
it just kind of made me think, well, and I think also the experience of doing it, it's not quite the same as running over the ground, but anyway, there's lots of sort of quite, I guess, people that have quite firm beliefs around these things. But I think some of the knowledge around these things is still very up in the air, as
yeah,
it were.
yeah. Well,
Yeah, yeah.
certainly, when you talk about running as a reflex, you
Mm,
see someplace you want to go there. Your eyes
yes,
and your head and spine go there first. When you're on
yes,
the
yeah.
treadmill, you're trying to imitate that because you're
Mm,
not going anywhere. And
yeah.
and so I if I'm stuck in a gym somewhere, I'll get on
Mm,
the rowing machine, not the treadmill. You know what I
yeah,
mean? Or
yeah, 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 yeah. I know what you.
or Nordic
Yeah,
track or an elliptical trainer. I said, oh God, I'm not gonna.
yeah. I know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
It's something. It's something you love doing, and a facsimile of it is not.
Well, that's it. It's like it's traveling without moving, isn't it? It's something
But
doesn't feel quite right about
I
it.
think that what you say is true in that the running properly does itself. You're
Mm,
outside, you want to go somewhere, you extend somewhere.
mm.
It's like it's a little weird swimming in one of those pools that moves the water,
Yes, yes, right,
and
right.
you see that you're not moving, and it's rather a
Mm,
weird thing. You're doing
yeah,
something muscular to keep yourself extending, but you're not like getting to the other end. It's weird.
yeah. It's strange. Yeah, I've never experienced that, but I can imagine it's a
Oh,
bizarre thing. Yeah.
not fun.
Yeah. um, so, look, I know another area that we've exchanged thoughts on in the past, and you've written about on your blog, is core stability. And I know you picked up on L. Liederman's Myth of Core Stability paper, um, and I was quite involved in reading around all that kind of core stability literature when it first came out and applying it with patients and so on. But I've also, kept up to speed and watched how that whole field has developed. And I think, your comments are really interesting around that. How would you sort of frame up that whole discussion around stabilization?
Well, you don't want to stabilize anything to move. You want everything to move.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the core muscles, there aren't really any. There are muscles
Mm-hmm.
in the center of your body, but they're not core to your movement. You know what I
Sure.
mean? You're still moving from the spine. And if you lengthen, you will not just be using spinal extensors, you will actually be using um, abdominal muscles, right? The
Mm-hmm.
abdominal muscles, the spinal extensors are thoracic spine, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So the idea of allowing length from the base of the pelvis to the top of the head involves muscles in the abdomen somehow.
Yes. Yeah.
But the idea that it's hardening them, and in fact, when you look at respiration and you look at a healthy inhale, the abdominal
Mm.
muscles will actually push up against the diaphragm to assist its ability
Mm.
to lift the ribs. So they're actually, in a healthy inhale, they're not
Mm.
letting go. So I mean,
Right.
there's something about taking a look and noticing if they're if they're not active, this isn't good.
Mm.
But then activating them, that's another thing. How do you activate them? Not directly. Not
Yeah. Yeah.
if you hold them. If you hold a muscle, it can't do what it should do in relation to other muscles. So you
Yes.
have to figure out a way of thinking uh, that's an outward opening thinking that allows all muscle groups to interact. You don't want anything to be not working,
Yes. Yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
this is a I don't know. It's a hard thing to get across.
Mm.
And I sort of lost friends in that barefoot running forum because no matter what anyone said, I would say no, I don't think so.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because all of these things about how to run, how your stride should look like, I don't know about that.
Mm.
And how
Mm.
to breathe is certainly, I don't know about that. It's
Mm.
reflex. There are a lot of muscles involved, and you focus on one, and the others aren't doing what they should. And
Yeah.
it's a
Well, one of the things that I know that you pointed out on that forum was because it was in response to Mark Cucuzzella's discussion on abdominal breathing and running. You kind of pointed out you only need to watch an athletics meet, and you can see that when the runners are running, but also even when they've stopped running at the end, you don't get huge abdominal excursion. I mean, you maybe a little bit more when they've stopped running and they're leaning over trying to recover, but certainly when they're running and obviously breathing hard to these long distance runners, it's not like their abdominal walls protruding right out as they inhale and coming back in as
No,
they exhale.
never. They all have a
Mm.
little skinny waist and nothing
Yeah.
bulging out. And I
Mm.
think of something like swimming, which is so obviously the spine needing the movement and the
Yes.
spine needing to extend so that the lats and the strong muscles that pull the arm down are opposed by the spine
Hmm.
lengthening.
Yeah. Yeah.
Show me a belly breathing swimmer. Oh, maybe you're doing the breaststroke. Maybe you do something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Swimming's not a good example because there's nothing very natural about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose not. But so from my understanding, because I did write a paper on the diaphragm partly because I just wanted to understand it better, and one of the things that was a bit of a revelation to me, and I think fits with your understanding, is that as the diaphragm contracts, part of what it does is because it meets resistance from the viscera, it expands the lower rib cage. So in other words,
Mm,
a lot of the initial phase of inhalation, at least, is actually the rib cage opening out in
mm.
response to the viscera being compressed and that drawing the air in. So it's not so much the abdominal wall
Yeah.
excursion in that instance.
Yes, and people will say, "Oh, the primary muscle of respiration is the diaphragm."
Mm.
Really? Well, how about spinal extensors? How about
Mm.
scalenes? How about
Mm-hmm.
sternocleidomastoids? The primary, in order for the lower ribs to lift and spread out, the upper ribs have to get out of the way.
Sure.
So the rib cage, the opening of the rib cage should begin at the top. And because in our culture we're sitting and fixed, we don't have that movement. We
Mm.
don't have the
Mm.
movement. We don't have the choice of opening the neck and letting the upper ribs move. So we get very involved in moving the diaphragm down, and
Yeah.
it's but working with classical singers,
Mm.
let me tell you, you get different things. But if the diaphragm moves down, the frontal ligament will suppress the larynx, and
Right.
it
Yeah.
will mess up the voice. So,
Yeah.
so good bel canto singers are very, very up in their ribs, and their diaphragm is not coming down.
Mm.
Although when I had voice strain problems in theater, shouting,
Mm.
and I went to an opera
Mm.
singer, an award-winning opera singer and teacher, and she had me barking. She had me doing this
Yeah. Yeah.
with the
Yeah.
diaphragm.
Yeah.
She said, "Oh, white men can't sing falsetto because they have tight assholes." And so here was an opera singer who was talking about that thing of filling up the whole torso with air all the way down to the base of the pelvis.
Mm.
Yeah, I don't know, man. Look at a deer when it's running. Look at its
Mm.
belly. Look at your
Mm.
dog. If a dog is panting and its belly's moving, something's wrong.
Yeah. Well, what this what comes up in my mind as you're describing this is that the mechanism I was just explaining in terms of the diaphragm obviously starts bowed up. As it contracts, it pulls down, or contracts down, pushing against the viscera. The viscera obviously can't go downwards because the pelvic floor is stopping them. So they go outwards and they create stretch. And the kind of classic story here is that the abdominal wall expands. So you get this big belly breath and the abdominal wall opens out. But if you keep tone in the abdominal wall, as you're describing there, and we see in animals, then of course that means the viscera can't go out either. So what it's going to do is it's going to increase the expansion of the lower rib cage and get the
Yep,
air in that way.
exactly,
So that
exactly. It's
that
going to oppose. The diaphragm is pulled up from above, pushed up
mm-hmm.
from below, so its primary
Yeah.
action of lifting
Mm.
is enabled. And I have some very good diagrams of the ligaments holding up the diaphragm and the pericardium. I mean, if
Mm.
your diaphragm's going to go down, so is your heart. I'm not sure
Yeah.
that's the best breathing, but
Right.
but you look far and wide to find that anywhere.
Mm.
To me,
Yeah.
it was a matter of logic. Look at how
Mm.
it's shaped. Look at how it's not just, there's an enormous amount of fascia
Mm.
binding the diaphragm to the pericardium, and then two huge pericardial ligaments holding it up. So
Yeah.
the only way the diaphragm's going down is it all goes down. It doesn't make much sense.
Mm. Yeah.
Especially,
Yeah.
like you
Yeah.
say, especially if you're lengthening like mad. Well, no,
Sure.
not necessarily.
Yeah.
You
Yeah. But I suppose that's different when you're laying down, right? So when someone lays down to sleep, they don't have the I guess the need to lengthen against gravity, or the stimulus to lengthen
But
against
they
gravity.
they don't. But
Mm.
they have the stimulus to lengthen against the contraction of the diaphragm. I mean,
Right.
I don't belly breathe when I lie down.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
No,
I was wondering if it did
I paid a
switch a
lot of
bit.
attention to it, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not obvious.
Okay.
It's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
obvious to keep everything free and mobile, but the action of the diaphragm pulling down stimulates the action of the spine to oppose it. The same way pulling your arm down and swimming
Yes.
stimulates the action of lengthening more.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's funny. I do cross country skiing, and then cross country ski coaches will all talk about poling. They'll all talk about
Mm-hmm.
the compression phase. You plant the pole, compress the abdominals.
Right.
Well, what's the muscle that pulls the arm down?
Yeah. The lats. Yeah.
It's the lats.
Yeah.
So if you compress, you're taking that out of play, and you're using your pectorals and your abdominals. It's just not It's just
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the things Phil Beach talks about is the fact that he's uh, very kind of suspicious of this whole focus by, in particular, the physiotherapists on the transverse abdominis and getting this to activate and so on. And he says that actually, okay, so he's not sort of trying to dismiss the importance of the transverse abdominis and its role in stabilizing the lumbopelvic region or allowing it to move, let's say, without aberrant. What would be a good way to phrase it? I mean, it clearly has some kind of role in keeping everything together. Let's
Mhm.
put it that
Yeah.
way. But the way he describes it is it's like squeezing a tube of toothpaste. So when you contract the transverse abdominis, that's like someone putting their hands around your waist and squeezing you and giving you lift. And so the way he would recommend training the transverse abdominis is to carry something on your shoulders and to walk or to run. And he says, like a deer, for example. And he's not advocating you necessarily go and carry a deer on your barefoot run, but he's saying that's what our systems have evolved to do. And by putting load on the shoulder girdle, it's going to create that sort of downward pressure, which requires a reciprocal upward lift.
Yeah.
I don't know. Does that fit with your way of
Yeah.
thinking?
Yeah. It does.
Mm.
And I know that when I put on a good backpack,
Mm.
I remember when my son was a baby and I carried him in a backpack a lot, with of course with a good hip belt.
Yeah, yeah.
But it was telling me to lengthen. It
Mm.
was
Mm.
waking up a kind of passivity, that
Yes.
yeah, a good
Yeah.
a good a good a good backpack is not such a bad thing.
Yeah, 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 for
You look
sure,
at
for
those
sure.
wonderful you know photos of Africans carrying huge loads on their heads.
Absolutely,
It's
absolutely.
it's
Yeah.
it's, it's amazing. Is it a good idea to put that on your cranium? No, probably not. But
Yeah,
I
yeah.
can remember in yoga, I did yoga when I was younger, and hurt myself staying in headstands for half an hour at a time. I thought that was a good thing,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
that people would do unassisted headstands with just weight on the head. And I thought, yeah, gee, I don't know that the cervical spine is particularly well evolved for supporting
Yeah,
hundreds
yeah.
of
When
pounds.
that's it, that's it. Yeah, yeah. When you look at the size of those vertebrae and those discs compared to
Yeah,
the ones in the lumbar spine, you think, yeah, maybe not so much.
and you're gently getting the bones of the head to move a little bit.
Mm, mm.
Do you really want to put 150 pounds on them?
Probably not. Probably not.
I mean, most people do not have that movement.
Yeah,
Can you get it
yeah.
back? Maybe, maybe not. Like in Alexander, there are people that come, and if they have some bad habits because they've sat badly or they're a little bit stressed or they sit at a computer,
Mm,
I can deal with them. If they've been systematically abused as kids, they're not going
mhm.
to free their necks. They're not going to let
Yeah,
go. They need
yeah.
they need something else. They need something more. There
Mm,
was when I was doing my training in New York. My teacher was a good teacher, but he was very manipulative. Yeah,
right.
Alexander, I'd never worked with him, but I worked with teachers trained by him. They barely touch you, and there's a huge input from it. And he
Mm,
would pull and tug, and there was a young dancer who we all saw getting more and more fragile. And he was excited
right.
to work with her because he could do a lot with her. He said, "No, no, no, Ellen, come here. Oh, do this, do this, do this." She had a complete nervous breakdown. She couldn't even
Mm,
take a bus home. Someone had to go with her
wow.
back. She spent a year at home,
Yeah.
which was probably not where she should have been.
Absolutely. And so, is this an example of kind of embodiment of emotions, and then by essentially training someone to let go of their protective postural
Yeah,
holding patterns,
yeah,
it emerges?
yeah. You
Is
got to
that?
you got to
Yeah.
be careful of that crap. That's not our
Mm,
job.
yeah.
You know,
Yeah. So, do you work with psychotherapists or other people that counselors, people that can help with that kind of a case, or
no.
what would your approach
I
be?
haven't had, in Montreal, I haven't had that kind of busy practice. I was
Mm,
teaching at a music school and working with a lot of students, but there was a teacher in Israel, one of my favorite teachers, Rika Cohen. She had a psychoanalyst on call, And I think she knew because she was a bit nuts. She was an
Right, right.
Israeli Olympic athlete who trained with Feldenkrais. And Feldenkrais said to Rico, you need to go to Alexander.
Mm.
Which is an interesting story. And she went and trained and came back and became one of the best teachers. But she said, I need to do this. I need to do it all day. Because she was mad.
Right, right.
She was afraid of elevators. She was, dealing with something.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the interesting things that I picked up fairly early on in my career, I came to the realization that muscles are very much like people, and if you push them too hard or pull them around, and you could say the same for joints, etc. But if you push someone, then they tend to resist, and it's like, I'm not going to go that way if you're going to push me
Yeah,
that way.
yeah,
They'll push back.
yeah,
But if you very gently say, how about going in that direction,
yeah,
or how about
exactly.
this direction, then they're much more inclined to go with you. So this light contact, which seems to be what you're saying that you tend to use with the Alexander. Is that right?
Well, the Alexander, the contact is twofold. You
Mm-hmm.
have to be doing what you want to happen in them because
Mm.
there's a kinesthetic empathy transfer. We learn a lot from being carried by our parents. We learn a
Yes.
lot about functioning our system. So if
Mm.
you're hardening in your body and you put your hands on someone's neck, you're basically telling them to harden their neck.
Yeah.
This is a
Yeah.
difficult thing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
on the other hand, oh, there was something I wanted to say that I liked. What was it? What was it? What were we talking about? Um,
Muscles are
that
like people, and
that I had
same
a
thing.
Russian boxer appear at my door one day. This
Yeah.
guy was 6'5", hulking, hunched over, and I thought, oh my God. And I
Mm.
started to work on him. He was like a child. He was like completely naive. He came
Wow.
right up under my hands. I moved him up to standing, and I said, "You notice the difference?" He said, "Well, yeah, but I can't stand like that." I said, "Why
Mm.
not?" He said, "Because I will fall over."
Mm.
And that's very revealing.
Mm.
It's very tricky to ask people to let go of things that they think they need
Right.
to stand
Right.
up, to survive. It's why in
Yes.
Alexander Technique we work on people sitting first, because sitting, they're not as fearful
Right.
of letting
Yeah. Yeah.
go. We want them to be upright and dealing with gravity, but standing, like this guy, I'm going to fall over.
Mm.
This is a very funny
Yeah.
thing. On the other hand, I
Yeah.
had a woman come to me one time who was a German. She only spoke German. Her daughter
Mm.
brought her. This is my grandmother. She was fine until she had a car accident. She hasn't been the same since. And I worked on her for about 15 minutes,
Mm.
and she started to move easily. And she said to her daughter, that's what I used to feel like. So she had an
Mm.
actual memory
Yeah.
of, most of us don't.
Mm.
Most of you were 5, you don't remember it. But
Yeah.
this woman
Yeah.
was,
Yeah. 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 It's
was
amazing.
like a rural German, and she knew what it was like to have good use, and she had a
Mm.
whiplash or something, and then her knees were bad. And I had another woman come, an
Yeah.
older woman who was going to have a knee replacement.
Mm.
And she said, "Oh, I can't do the chair work." And I said, "Why not?" And she folded her knees to go to the chair, and you could hear the grinding the whole way across the
Right.
room.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
said, "Oh, well, let's just work on the table a little bit." I worked on the table, and I brought her up, and I just sort of folded her knees, and she went right to the chair with no sound.
Hmm.
Why?
Wow.
Because she was
Mm.
pulling her knees together, and her anterior cartilage was gone,
Yeah. Yeah.
the lateral cartilage, but she still had some cartilage in the inner part of the knee. And when the weight was shifted there, you know, but once you get that grinding
Certainly. Yeah.
sound, man,
Yeah.
that's an
It's a big.
unrelated story. It's just me telling stories of.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Well, so what you were just describing sort of brings up for me is the whole idea that kids often are in this day and age, and in fact for probably 40 or 50 years have been often either accelerated through their infant development process, and or put into buggies and pushchairs and this kind of thing. And so there's a kind of couple of aspects to this. The first is that we know that by going through that infant development process, that it inhibits some of the reflexes that we've talked about earlier, in particular the Moro reflex, but a whole bunch of infantile reflexes that, generally speaking, should be inhibited by that infant development process. But then also, as we were just alluding to, kids learn from being moved and being carried, and of course, using push chairs and buggies and these kinds of things, this is not a natural human movement. And I wonder how much of these kinds of contraptions that we've developed for little kids, for them to sit up and be propped
Mm,
up, or to bounce around in,
yeah.
or to be pushed around in, how much of that is impacting them from a kind of Alexander or reflexive perspective.
Yeah, I think that my son is a perfect example. He had major
Mm-hmm.
heart surgery in his first weeks, so he didn't
Mm.
start well. His
Mm.
rib cage cut open. You could see the
Yeah,
tension.
yeah.
But today, he's 27, 28. He was never supposed to exercise. He runs
Mm.
in barefoot shoes. His
Yeah.
heart is recovered. His aorta is recovered. But interestingly, he's never had Alexander lessons. But what he had was an environment without sofas,
Mm.
with hard stools at the right height,
Mm.
with parents who weren't slouching, both of us Alexander teachers. I never put him in a slouch carriage. At
Mm.
one point, I bought a running jogger, thinking, oh, I'll take runs with him. He hated it. I sold it right away.
Right,
Putting
right.
him in that
Yeah.
slingback thing, I had an old style carriage where he'd sit up and hold on to the bar and look around.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he's been a really interesting case because he was not allowed to do exercise when he was young. They said it would kill him and da 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 da.
Mm-hmm.
And gradually, he's been able to. And
Right.
I bought him some some Merrill trail gloves at some point. I said, "Oh, just some sneakers." And he
Mm.
goes out and runs miles and miles with them. And he runs
Wow.
a 4 foot runner. He's a beautiful runner.
Mm.
And it was seeing two parents who tried to use themselves well. No
Yeah, yeah.
sofa, no slouch chairs, sit in a little
Mm.
stool. And your kid, of course, you can squat and sit on the floor. I can't sit in the
Yeah.
floor. I can't sit in the floor anymore.
Right.
I
Yes.
should be able to, but I
Yeah.
can still. I squat very well.
Okay.
I don't stay in it very long, and I should.
Yeah.
I should.
Mm.
It's a very for conditioning the glutes. Is
Mm-hmm.
monoarticular muscles, lengthening them.
Yeah.
It's a
For
good
sure.
it's a good thing. We should be doing
Definitely.
it.
Well, that's part of Phil's whole sort of drive, is to get people using the floor more. To
Yeah.
what his one of his theories is what he calls archetypal rest postures, and that's the idea that, of course, across cultures, multiple different peoples use the floor as their place of choice to rest. They don't have chairs, and so when you do that, of course, you only have a certain series of postures you can adopt, and one is the deep squat, and then there's the various kneeling positions. There's the lotus position that you mentioned earlier as a precautionary thing, and sitting long-legged as well. Sitting with the legs out, stretched long in front of you, and what that seems to do, from at least my understanding, is it creates a series of different postures that stretch a series of different muscles,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
none of them are inherently that comfortable. So if you adopt one of them, then the chances are that within a few minutes you're going to want to switch to a different one, and you're going to keep changing positions, and that helps. It's a kind of a natural way of optimizing the length tension relationships around those lower limb muscles in particular.
Well, when I was younger, I did years of meditation. I'd sit
Mm.
twice a day for 45 minutes, and
Mm.
I have narrow hips. I don't have a lotus position. If I want to force the hell out of my knees. So I sit on
Mm.
my
Mm.
heels, and
Right.
which put the back in a very good position, completely put my legs to sleep. Really not very
Mm.
good for them. Later, I got a size bench. And,
Yeah, yeah.
and then I thought, well, why don't you just sit in a stool
Yeah,
with
yeah.
your hands in your lap, both feet on the ground? What could be better? Everything's connected and alive. We,
Mm.
we do have a stool. Why not sit in one? And even in the Zen schools in the East here, they say, yeah, yeah, you can sit in a chair because people can't sit on the floor. And should you force yourself to sit on the floor to meditate? That's not the idea. And that sitting on the heels is cutting off the circulation of your legs. You're denying them as part of yourself. Sitting in the lotus position too, you can't be connected with them. It's kind of like you said. I mean, if you could sit with your legs in front of you, God bless you.
Yes.
You know,
Exactly.
but I mean, I know that in Zen, they you sit on a zabuton, you boost yourself up a little bit, so you're not.
Right.
But
Makes sense.
it's so important when people talk about, and you know this, that people talk about alignment. Well, what's aligned? We're not aligned. We don't want an equal burden in anterior and posterior trunk muscles. We want the extensors in the back to be taking the work, and the muscles in the anterior to be free so you can breathe. The head doesn't balance on the spine. We don't balance on our hips. You can't draw a line through the ear, neck. All that
Yeah.
crazy alignment stuff. And
Yeah. Yeah.
when you see good Zen meditation posture, they don't pull their jaws in, and that's what we do to try to be like them. And that was a big thing with me that I was a '60s kid and a little bit slouched. So in ballet, they said, lift your chest up, pull your shoulders back, pull your chin in, and I got very good at doing that.
Yeah.
So even in film, I look sort of okay, and it ruined me. It just pulled me apart.
Right. Right.
I was holding myself like that 24/7.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. That creates a lot of tension. Okay. Well, look, Lawrence, I know we spent a long time talking so far, and also I think you're aware the podcast is called From Chaos to Order, and I think you've helped us to identify some order from the chaos. But have you got any sort of simple nuggets of wisdom for people that would like to explore some of your wisdom and experience of working as an Alexander practitioner for as long as you have now?
Stop and look around. That, I think, is the most important thing, not to take the attention of one thing into the next thing, but to have a moment where you're just a dog on the porch. Those moments of, oh, there's a tree. Look at the tree. You have to have those moments, and because you're going to do things where you're hunched over at the computer, you're cutting off your peripheral vision. You're going to do those things.
Yeah.
You don't want to take it into the next thing. You want to have a space between, okay, now I'm here. And it's hard to shut the brain off, isn't it? I mean, you can go for a good run and be thinking about all kinds of crap, And I don't know. I would just say look around. The connection is with the world around you, not something interior, not closing your eyes and going deep in yourself. And in Zen, they don't close their eyes when they meditate. There's a good reason for that.
Right.
You want a free neck, you look around.
Well, that's been brilliant today, Lawrence. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it, and for sharing all of your insights.
Well, for me, it's been a pleasure meeting you online. I've kind of spoken to you on the forum, and I realized our views were similar on a lot of things, and it's been fun to talk. What if we just disagreed on everything?
Yeah, it would have made for a really interesting
that would have been
podcast.
fun. Anyway,
no, that's fantastic. So I'd really like to thank you, and I'm sure our paths will cross down the line. But I'll certainly let you know when this is up, and feel free to share it with anyone that you think might be interested.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic.
Bye.
All right, thanks, Lawrence. Take care. Bye-bye. So there we go. That was Lawrence Smith, Alexander teacher and barefoot runner, among many other accolades. If you're like me, there were several aspects of Lawrence's experiences and understandings that challenged my own beliefs, plenty more that resonated, and all of them were fascinating and have helped me to get a new perspective on human movement and performance. Alexander technique, just like many of these specialized movement disciplines, has continued to evolve since Alexander first suggested his ideas around a century ago. And often, with the benefit of hindsight, we can really appreciate others' foresight. Next week, we have the amazing Bronnie Lennox-Thompson from New Zealand on FC2O to help us understand more about how to work with individuals who are experiencing persistent pain. Look forward to seeing you at the next show.